After the continued struggle through Weiss's nightmare, the finale of Ice Queendom is finally here, and I gotta say, this finale checked a lot of boxes for me. It wrapped up a lot of things from Ice Queendom very well, and even answered a couple of the lingering questions that I had from throughout the season. But before I get into all of that, I will say spoiler warning for those who have not seen episode 12 of Ice Queendom. I won't be showing the episode or any clips from it in this video, simply images of the episode and analyzing the events that take place. I'll leave links in the description below so you guys can go to either Rooster Teeth First or Crunchyroll and watch this amazing series there. And I really do recommend it because this series is overall such a wonderful show. Now, the episode starts off with all of Team RWBY relaxing in their dorm room, each able to take the time to do the activities that they enjoy. A moment of peace after everything they've gone through struggling against the nightmare. And a moment that really brings back the days at Beacon Academy. It's these tranquil moments of peace that we really don't get anymore in the RWBY series, given the drastic situation that the series is headed towards and the tonal shift that the series has taken overall after the events of Volume 3. So I really appreciate seeing these quiet moments. RWBY and Weiss are both writing to their respective relatives, RWBY to Tai and Weiss to Winter, telling them about the events that have transpired, how RWBY was made leader of their team, and how they are all becoming closer as teammates. Though notably also leaving out the events of the nightmare, as that would probably just go to worry both Tai and Winter. Yang is playing on her scroll, and Blake is reading her Ninjas of Love. I still would have liked to see Ninjas of Love added to the library that was in Blake's room within Weiss's dream, but I'm still glad that it was included in Ice Queendom as a whole. Yang starts bothering Blake to start playing video games with her, and, well, we see how that goes, because Blake probably hasn't played video games up until this point. As RWBY is writing, she reminisces about the conversation that likely just happened immediately after Weiss was rescued from her dream. How Weiss and Blake had a chance to talk. How Blake is going to try trusting her teammates more with the information of, previously being a member of the White Fang and the things that she's thinking to help them become closer as teammates, and both of them agree to do so, which was a very touching moment. In Volume 1, when we just had Weiss and Blake talking after the events of the docks, it really didn't seem all that conclusive, and then we jump all the way to Volume 2 at the beginning of their next term, and everything's kind of hunky-dory. I'm glad to get this little conversation here, as well as a little bit later in the episode, where they are able to work things out. We then cut to the moment where Shion Zaiden is leaving Beacon Academy, and they have some words of wisdom for Team RWBY and Juniper, exclaiming that both of them are excellent teams, and also explains a little bit about their semblance. Shion says that their semblance, when it was first awakened, used to be the ability to read people's hearts, but after their experience with training, and once they encountered the nightmare, their semblance grew into something more, which is what it is now, the ability to connect people's hearts together. Still very related to the initial ability, but something that is an evolved ability. Essentially, introducing the concept of semblance evolution right at the end of Volume 1. Given what we know now in Volume 8, seeing Ren's semblance evolve after the struggles that he went through, I really like the idea of having the concept of semblance evolution introduced while the students are back at Beacon Academy. Because if it is possible for everyone to have the potential to evolve their semblance through experiences and training that they may have, then I feel like that's something that should be introduced at the Academy. Because Ozpin especially should know about semblance evolution, not to mention some of the more experienced characters that we've seen throughout the series. Glinda Goodwitch, for example, the other professors of Beacon Academy, which, as a side note, I really wish we could have been introduced to a couple of other professors that have been mentioned at Beacon Academy and haven't had the chance to be shown yet. That would have been a really nice addition in Ice Queendom, but alas, I'm still very happy we got Shion Zaiden. But regardless, this is something that the professors and Team Stark and other experienced people in the world of Remnant, other experienced huntsmen and huntresses, should know about, and thus it should be something that they are able to prepare the young students for. Because Ren was surprised when his semblance evolved. He was surprised to have this new ability. But had they been taught about it earlier, and perhaps this is something that would happen in the later years at the Academy, maybe it's something they address in second, third, or fourth year, that their abilities might change later on, and, you know, Team RWBY and Juniper only being first years, they just never got the chance to learn it, so, you know, I'll let that slide there. But overall, I do like the idea of introducing semblance evolution here, though it does seem a little bit kind of forced with Shion just randomly explaining this as their parting words to Team RWBY and Juniper, but also exclaiming that they have the potential to grow much stronger. And this is the last that we see of Shion Zaiden in the entire series. A bit disappointing, since we didn't get to see Shion fight in really any capacity at all, other than ensnaring the nightmares and putting them in a little bottle, but I really would have liked to see Shion do more. We did get confirmation now of what Shion's semblance is and was, that it is only the ability to connect people's hearts together, not the ability to manipulate string. That is, you know, separate, and I'm going to make a separate video on Shion's abilities, but it's still nice to have this all wrapped up, with Shion knowing their abilities and introducing some new ideas and concepts that sets things up for the future, and also, for a new viewer, would build interest for seeing how things would grow in the RWBY series. After Shion leaves, Ozpin then asks to speak to both RWBY and Blake individually. A little bit ominous, as they don't really have an idea as to why Ozpin wants to speak with them, but when we see their conversations, it becomes clear. And the first conversation Ozpin has is with RWBY, and I am very happy that they put this conversation into Ice Queendom, because it answers my concern from last episode about Ozpin seeing RWBY activate her Silver Eyes, and my concern was that he was just gonna do nothing about it, but he does here. He first calls RWBY in and starts asking her if she's a bit more comfortable being a team leader now that she's had some more experience with her team, but then that leads into the question of Ozpin asking RWBY, did you experience anything when you defeated the Nightmare that was different from semblance and aura? Essentially asking her about the Silver Eyes without directly stating it. And RWBY, you know, doesn't really remember. Everything was happening so fast, it was all a blur, and she thinks that Ozpin is asking about how friends make her stronger, and that's the answer that she gives. And so Ozpin is satisfied with that. He knows and has recognized that the power is beginning to awaken, but is not going to say anything to RWBY until she actually remembers awakening it. And I think that is very important for teaching someone how to use the Silver Eyes. And so Ozpin ends off by saying that as RWBY experiences more, she will awaken the power hidden inside of her, giving a hint to RWBY that there is more that she has, though I don't really think RWBY really understands what Ozpin is talking about, as when she goes down to talk to the rest of her team and they ask her what exactly Ozpin wanted to talk to her about, she just said, oh, you know, how friends make you stronger and how we're growing closer as a team, etc., and not mentioning anything about or really acknowledging that Ozpin was fishing for a power that was different than semblance and aura. I feel like RWBY should have maybe been a little bit curious about Ozpin mentioning that, considering all students have only been taught about semblance and aura up until that point. Having something else would be, you know, very useful and also different than what she would know, but again, for the sake of the plot, they don't really want to get into that in the last episode. But this conversation is extremely important, as it shows Ozpin's mentality not only throughout Ice Queendom, but also throughout the first 3 volumes of the RWBY series. I had initially planned to make a video about Ozpin knowing about the Silver Eyes and why he didn't say anything, why that doesn't make sense, and, you know, I still might, however, the overall framing of the video is going to change, because given this conversation, it does make sense. After last episode, I thought a lot about Ozpin knowing about the Silver Eyes, and I came to the conclusion that the reason Ozpin skipped RWBY ahead 2 years, and even made her a leader of her own team, was because she has the Silver Eyes, and this would give Ozpin more of a chance to nurture that ability, and with RWBY being leader of a team, that's going to put her in a position where she has to focus on all of her teammates and care about them more, realize what decisions she's making, and if she makes the wrong one, then the desire to protect them, the desire to fix that mistake, might awaken the Silver Eyes sooner than it otherwise would have. Ozpin is planning and trying to awaken RWBY's Silver Eyes, but it's important that he doesn't tell her about the ability before she awakens it, as we saw with Maria in Volume 6. When Maria was talking to RWBY and telling her, or trying to coach her to activate the Silver Eyes, she had to say, remember how you felt when you first activated it. Your desire to protect life. She needs that first experience, because my guess would be, if you tell a Silver-Eyed Warrior, hey, you have this ability, you need to focus on positive thoughts and the desire to protect life, and then you might be able to activate the eye lasers, well, they might end up focusing on the wrong thing. But if they have that previous experience of feeling how it felt to activate the Silver Eyes, then, there's something for them to focus on and a goal for them to strive towards. But Ozpin, in this moment, was fully prepared to tell RWBY about the Silver Eyes had she remembered the experience. Had she remembered that feeling, Ozpin, at this moment, I fully believe he would have told RWBY about the Silver Eyes and started her training with them. I don't think it's required that a Silver-Eyed Warrior needs to train another Silver-Eyed Warrior. They just need to have the knowledge about how the Silver Eyes are activated, which Ozpin certainly does. And I think I will make a separate video on that going into more detail, but this conversation was really important for me to have in this episode, and I'm really glad they included it. After RWBY's conversation with Ozpin, she goes, meets the rest of her team, and it's Blake's turn to go up and talk to him. And Blake tells the rest of them to go ahead to the cafe. They're going to invite Team Juniper, and all just kind of have a day out at the cafe, just relaxing and not focusing on their studies, considering this is supposedly their vacation. And Blake just tells them to all go on ahead. So when Blake goes up to Ozpin's office, we get the same conversation that Blake and Ozpin had in Volume 2. Though when they had it in Volume 2, it was in Episode 2, so after the food fight and after the term had already begun. The conversation plays out pretty much the same. Ozpin is commending Blake's skills at stopping the attack on the docks, that Roman Torchwick was working with the White Fang, and Ozpin then questions how Blake knew that the White Fang was going to be there. Well, it was a lucky hunch, and Ozpin seems a little bit more direct and ominous in this conversation compared to how he was in Volume 2. We can tell as the audience that he's pressing Blake, trying to see if she's still a member of the White Fang and has some other nefarious goals for being at Beacon Academy. But when Blake insists that she had no prior knowledge of it actually being the White Fang until she first encountered them, Ozpin relents and says that he looks forward to seeing how she progresses. And, that she should be welcome to come and talk to him at any point in time. But given the looks that he gave her throughout this conversation and blatantly saying to her that I will use all of my power to stop those who disrupt the peace, well, that might prevent people from feeling that comfortable going and talking to you at that point, especially with Blake knowing that she was once a member of the White Fang, so, he might be playing counter to himself in this conversation. But he also said he's going to use everything in his power to stop those who disrupt the peace. And I know what he was referring to. People like Roman Torchwick, the White Fang, those who are actually trying to hurt other people. But the way he phrased it, disrupting the peace, given what happens in this very episode, that's kind of Team RWBY's entire MO. They disrupt the peace at Beacon Academy all the time. They go out of their way to disobey the rules, and, Ozpin does turn a blind eye to that, but still a funny little coincidence I saw there. After the conversation, Blake returns to the base of the tower, expecting that her team had moved on, but one of the members of her team stayed behind. Weiss wanted to chat with Blake. Again, I am really happy to see more interaction between Weiss and Blake over the topics and conflict that they had previously in Volume 1 and in Ice Queendom up until now, especially after everything they experienced in Weiss's nightmare, and Blake's nightmare at that as well. And as they are walking to the cafe to meet up with RWBY and Yang, Weiss starts asking Blake if she plans to rejoin the White Fang after Beacon Academy, if she's planning to use the knowledge and power that she gains from studying at Beacon to harm others. And Blake, of course, says, no, I don't plan on doing that at all. And Weiss goes further to say that she will not ignore the dark side of the Schnee Dust Company, that she wants to change it, and she makes the offer to Blake, at least I interpret it as an offer, by saying, I will need people like you when the time comes. Essentially extending that olive branch, asking Blake for her help in changing the Schnee Dust Company together. And that is such an interesting direction to take their storyline. It's, in my mind, very much deviating from what we see in Volume 2, where Blake's focus is still heavily on the White Fang. Of course, the White Fang is still something that's in the back of her mind, her experiences with Adam, and, you know, it's a major part of her past, but having this offer from Weiss and having this idea in her head gives her a new goal to strive towards that I think sets up the story of Ice Queendom to go in a fairly different direction than in Volume 2, where she wouldn't be focusing on the White Fang so much to her own detriment, instead maybe working with Weiss, trying to come up with a plan to change the Schnee Dust Company or something like that. It's honestly a storyline I would really like explored if Ice Queendom might have a chance at getting a season 2, having the deviation entirely from the RWBY storyline and seeing where it goes from there. But for now, we will have to wait and see. In the meantime, we see what's happening with RWBY and Yang. Yang is exclaiming how much RWBY has changed since first coming to Beacon Academy, how she only needed her weapon, that she didn't need new friends, and everything of that like that we saw at the beginning of Volume 1. Not really so much in Ice Queendom, just a brief scene at the beginning, but RWBY also says that that was partly due to Yang teasing her, saying that she didn't want to be on the same team as her, etc., and Yang kind of brushing that off, saying they were on the same team anyways. And this, of course, prompts RWBY to say, fine, I'm just going to do things myself and, you know, make a lot more friends, showing how her mentality really has changed. And speaking of that, a new friend does show up. Sun arrives and starts talking to RWBY and Yang, saying that his team is going to arrive soon enough and he'd like to introduce them to all of Team RWBY. And of course RWBY is game for that as she wants to make new friends. At that moment, Blake and Weiss show up, and all of them are a bit surprised when Weiss invites Sun to join them, and Yang just blatantly asks, "You're okay with sitting down with a faunus?" And Weiss just looks at her and says, "When did I ever say I wouldn't be?" Which, you know, calling him a rapscallion and a criminal might be a good hint, but, you know, she did never blatantly say that she wouldn't sit down and talk with him. So, you know, I guess that's true. However, the preconception was definitely warranted. And as they do sit down and talk, Weiss asks Sun not to say anything about Blake's past, to keep it to himself, as well as keep the secret that Blake is a faunus. Now it's Weiss asking Sun this, which feels a bit odd as Blake's kind of just sitting there with her head down, letting Weiss speak. I feel like this is something that Blake would have asked Sun directly. She does speak up and kind of parrot that, saying that please do that for me, etc. Whereas Weiss is kind of saying, you know, it's an exchange. You do that for us, and we won't report you to the police. So, kind of blackmail, but also not entirely unwarranted. Regardless, they come to the agreement that Sun will keep his mouth shut, though we know at the beginning of Volume 2, in the very first episode, he blabs to Neptune that Blake is a faunus, so, yeah, we'll see how well he keeps that secret in Ice Queendom. Again, assuming we get a Season 2, so we'll have to wait for that. But then it comes up to the topic that Team Juniper isn't there, and they're wondering where Team Juniper is. But apparently they are spending their vacation training Jaune, because, as we know, he is very untrained. He didn't study at any of the academies previously and really had no combat experience leading up to faking his application to get into Beacon Academy. So Pyrrha is spending her time training him, and kind of Ren and Nora are along for the ride. And this prompts Weiss to say that Pyrrha really is kind of a glutton for punishment, that she doesn't have to put up with that. She could have joined a different team. Which brings up the whole conversation about Weiss wanting to be on Pyrrha's team instead of Team RWBY. Weiss gets a little bit defensive and says, well, when did I ever say that I wanted to leave the team? And they all kind of laugh it off, but that does bring up the point that this plot of Weiss wanting to be on Pyrrha's team, that she would have been the ideal teammate, both of them together would have, you know, conquered the school or been at the top of the class or whatever it was brought up, very important, in the first 3 episodes, and then just kind of dropped until now, and hasn't really been relevant. So I don't really know what the point of including this, or at least emphasizing it, in Ice Queendom was. Because at the beginning of Volume 1, Weiss did want to be on Pyrrha's team, but at least in the original, she gave up on that pretty quick now that she was assigned to Team RWBY, instead focusing more on wanting to be leader of the team rather than be on a separate team entirely, whereas in Ice Queendom, she had a lot more focus on Pyrrha, which I think a lot of us were anticipating was going to be a larger thing, especially in Weiss's dream, with Pyrrha being there and Pyrrha really not doing anything overall. So it's still a bit confusing to me that this plot point was focused on so much and then just kind of pushed to the wayside and dropped, left to just this little conversation at the end. It does wrap up the plot point at the very least, but still is curious why it was focused on so much to begin with. It is worth it to note that during this conversation, Yang does bring up the possibility of maybe trading Weiss for a member of Team Juniper, which honestly, if they were going to trade 1 for 1, the only member that they could trade for would be Jaune, because you're not splitting up Ren and Nora, and Weiss wants to be on the same team with Pyrrha, so that would be how the teams would have to switch. Be an interesting team dynamic, to say the least, but it really shows that Yang has just no chill when it comes to making fun of Weiss. Because during the entire nightmare sequence, while Weiss was trapped within her dream, Yang was just berating her constantly. Now, in this scene, it's a lot more joking, but in previous scenes, it really wasn't, and I'm sensing still some tension between Yang and Weiss here, or at least from Yang's perspective. Maybe not in Weiss's mind at the very least, because there was that conversation between Yang and Weiss that happened in episode 3 that was never really addressed and given a conclusion. Perhaps, again, something that may be addressed in a season 2, if we're lucky enough to get one. And then we get to see how Jaune's training is going. Pyrrha is there training Jaune, teaching him the basics, getting him to repeat the movements, and essentially just doing the basic training that he should have had before getting to Beacon Academy. And Ren and Nora are kind of just there on the sidelines. Nora received the picture from RWBY showing that the entire team was having fun together, out relaxing, and Nora expresses that she kind of wishes she could do that too. I'm curious why her and Ren don't, because it doesn't really seem like they're actually participating and helping with the training. Instead, having Pyrrha focus on Jaune and Jaune focus on Pyrrha's words more than anything. So I understand that they're there to support the rest of their team, and it does make sense, but also if they just said, hey, you know, we're not really doing anything here, we're just gonna go out, go for some coffee or whatever, I don't think Pyrrha or Jaune would have minded, so, you know. But as they are actually getting up to leave, they do say something interesting. Nora, of course, comments on how weak Jaune is, and he's still saying things that he wants to protect the rest of his team, really going to his whole Joan of Arc inspiration, and how Jaune is as a character as we've come to know him through the 8 volumes of RWBY, that he definitely is like the guardian and protector of the team. Nora also says something that was very interesting and stood out to me. Might just be a throwaway comment, but she said that, well, after all, Ren, you are the strongest of us. When Nora said that, all that I could think was like, are you including Pyrrha in that? You know, the highly acclaimed warrior that's won multiple tournaments and is literally known as the untouchable girl? Is Ren hiding some secret powers in Ice Queendom or something? Because in Volumes 1 and 2 of RWBY, Ren was kind of almost a joke character when it came to fights, in some situations. When he fought against the King Taijitu, he definitely was a badass, showing the abilities of Aura and the things that he could do, some of which I think may not have stayed consistent throughout all of RWBY, but still definitely showcasing his skills in a fight and showing that he does have a lot of skill, but then against the Deathstalker he kind of got thrown against a wall and collapsed. And even in the food fight in Volume 2, he kind of got hit and then collapsed as well. So, you know, when Nora says that he's the strongest, I'm guessing that's her just playing into trying to boost Ren's confidence and being very supportive of Ren, because we obviously know how Nora feels about him, so I think that's along the lines. It just really did stand out to me. And then the final scene of the overall episode is we get Team RWBY in the cafeteria the day before their second term is meant to begin. And things begin to play out very similarly to the first episode of Volume 2. Blake is in the cafeteria reading one of her books and seemingly drawing an image of Adam, though Adam, as far as I know, never wore his sword on his back, so maybe that's something a younger version of Adam did before he became how we know him today, before Blake became disillusioned with the White Fang, and maybe that's the version of Adam that she still wants to try to connect to, maybe later on. Potentially. And then Yang comes over, teases Blake about what she was drawing, that she was writing something else, and would love to be able to read it later, but that conversation is quickly dropped when RWBY slams down an entire encyclopedia of what she wants to do in a single day, the same as she did in Volume 1. Of course, stealing Weiss's binder to do so. And at the same time, Yang is starting to catch food in her mouth from Nora. And once she pulls a stereotypical Barbara and starts things off with a pun, or starts things off with a Yang, and then she gets an apple to the head from Nora. And so they start tossing food back and forth at each other. And then Weiss stands up only to catch a pie in the face, thus initiating the food fight. Or at least it did in Volume 2. We didn't actually get to see what happened between Weiss catching the pie in her face versus the food fight actually beginning. But we do in Ice Queendom. We get a little added context. Everyone's a bit shocked that Weiss took the pie to the face, but she took it very well. Instead, saying that for their last day of their vacation, why don't they continue a time-honored Beacon tradition? That's of the food fight. So it was Weiss's suggestion to go into this entire food fight. Now, given what we have seen in Volume 2, I don't necessarily think that fits with Weiss's character, because she was still very much the Ice Queen at that point in time to certain people, especially towards Jaune, but also still a little bit cold in general. She hadn't warmed up quite that much, whereas here, it really seems like the experiences of the nightmare, and especially kind of letting her sillies out a little bit, you know, embracing the things that she wanted to do as a child, getting to play with her team, is really coming out more here. I definitely like this side of Weiss, but I don't think it really fits if we are trying to move this right into the events of Volume 2 afterwards. As we know, it is an alternate universe, but still, I think they're trying to fit it in as much as possible. Regardless, both teams are up for a little property damage, and so the fight begins. We don't get to see the entire food fight as it was in Volume 2, but we do get to see little snippets of it. Some attacks land differently than they did in the original, but overall, it was very nice to see some scenes of this food fight animated. One major difference, though, is that Sun and Neptune don't actually arrive. Obviously, because they didn't want to introduce Neptune in like the final 3 minutes of the first season of Ice Queendom. That would throw any new viewers off, like, who's this random new guy? Instead, they have Ozpin and Glinda walking up as the food fight's beginning and watching it as it unfolds. So, you know, Ozpin kind of told Glinda, I'm guessing at that point, let them have their fun. Once they start taking it a little bit too far, like, you know, sending Yang flying through the ceiling and actually causing damage to the school. Also, maybe, you know, cracking the entire wall and damaging things more than easily fixable. Let's leave it at that. Then Glinda can intervene. So Ozpin probably held Glinda back to let the students have their fun. As we know what he said in Volume 2, let them play the part of children. It is a role that they will not have forever. And although we don't actually get Ozpin's speech here, we do get a continuation of the speech from the beginning of the RWBY series as a whole, where Salem is talking to Ozpin. And she's saying that even the most brilliant lights will eventually flicker and die, for the guardians of the light to be on guard, but to take heed that there is no victory in strength. And of course, Ozpin countering, saying that maybe victory lies in the simpler things, in a smaller, more honest soul. And we get some absolutely stunning visuals of each of the members of Team RWBY as this speech is going on, and this is where Ice Queendom ends, with the after credits scene being a tribute to Monty, without whom none of this would even exist. None of the RWBY community, this anime, or really me talking to any of you. So, this wraps up Ice Queendom, and I gotta say, as a final episode, I really enjoyed it. I still consider episode 11 of Ice Queendom to far and away be the best episode of the series, given the animation, the fights, but the meaning behind a lot of things in Ice Queendom, and especially in this episode, how it very nicely wrapped a lot of things up. There are still some outlying things that don't exactly make sense with how Ice Queendom progressed, but overall, definitely a very satisfying end, and I really look forward to watching the entirety of Ice Queendom in one go. There's a lot of things that I think may not be picked up on watching it episode to episode, week by week, whereas watching it all in one go, things might start to make a little bit more sense, as especially within the dream, things didn't make sense at first glance, but after rewatching things, it starts to make more sense. So overall, I really did enjoy this episode. Getting that conversation between Ozpin and RWBY, showing that he is actively waiting for RWBY to activate her Silver Eyes, and very likely at that point would go into her training, tell her exactly what that is, because Ozpin, with his decades, centuries, millennia of experience, knows how powerful and useful Silver-Eyed warriors are. As I mentioned before, that's likely why he jumped RWBY ahead 2 years. The first thing he said to her was commenting on her silver eyes. Sure, she was trained by Crow, but, you know, Pyrrha was also a highly skilled warrior. She wasn't jumped ahead any years. It's because of RWBY's Silver Eyes, and I think that's why Ozpin made her team leader, to put her in that situation where she would more likely, or at least sooner, awaken her Silver Eyes, and thus be able to nurture that power, nurture that ability moving forward. Though we haven't really seen any of that in the RWBY series, given everything that happened. But I'll get into that in its own video. Seeing Blake and Weiss having more interaction after the events of Volume 1 transpired was really nice to see. Some conclusion to that overall conflict, and also a potential new storyline for them to move forward, as Weiss kind of did offer to Blake to help change the Schnee-Dust Company together, where she could then move on from her focus on the White Fang to focusing on creating change in a different way, going directly to the source with, you know, Weiss Schnee, the heiress to the company, to try to change a lot of the things that are wrong in the world when it comes to discrimination against the Faunus. Now, one last thing I want to mention, and I'd like your opinion on this as well, is what exactly was the timeline of Volume 1 and Ice Queendom as a whole? At what point did Weiss get afflicted by the nightmare? Because I've always operated under the assumption that the events of Volume 1 kind of took place, like, over the first month of the term, but now that Ice Queendom has addressed this with the conversation that Ozpin had with Blake, you know, he'd probably have that conversation with her about the incident at the docks immediately after it happened. But even in Volume 2, that happened at the beginning of their second term. So that kind of leads me to believe that the incident at the docks did happen at the end of their first term at Beacon Academy, which would also mean that the conflict that RWBY, Yang, and Blake were having with Weiss, and how she was not really acting like that great of a person and that great of a teammate, that happened for like 4 months before it eventually got resolved, which I kind of find unbelievable that they would let it go on that long. They probably would have sat her down long before that and tried to work things out. Though we also know that the incident at the docks happened before Weiss fell victim to the nightmare, and while Weiss was under the influence of the nightmare, Team Juniper still had to go to class, at least at one point. The third jump into Weiss's dream, the rest of Team Juniper was able to stay there and watch, since one of their teammates was also jumping into the dream, but presumably they still had class. So my initial thinking has always been that it's been a couple weeks or a month, and that seems like it fits there, though it wouldn't make sense for Ozpin to wait that long to address the issue with Blake. So I don't exactly know what the timeline is here, because the conversation that Ozpin had with Blake in Ice Queendom happens during the vacation that Team RWBY is having, so the break between terms. So it's definitely happening after their first term. So, you know, things aren't exactly fitting, and I would love to know your opinion on that. The way I'm kind of leaning now is that Weiss did act that way for the entirety of their first term, and, you know, 4 months later, that's when the incident at the dock happens. not, you know, a couple weeks in, and that would also mean that Weiss had the nightmare within her body for like 3 to 4 months, that it was just sitting there incubating. No one noticed the marks on her neck during that time, because we do know when Jaune was infected with the nightmare, everyone could blatantly see it. So, you know, some things don't exactly fit quite right there. Jaune was only infected for like a day, awoke his aura, and then fell victim to the nightmare. And I know Weiss has a lot stronger of an aura, but for it to stay dormant for like 4 months, that's pretty impressive for a Grimm to do that. So, you know, again, let me know your thoughts down in the comments below. So overall, I'm really happy with the way that Ice Queendom ended. I've loved this series overall, even though I've had some criticisms of it, and I really do highly recommend that anyone who hasn't watched it yet, go and do so when you get the chance, because it is really worth the watch. Getting to learn more about all of these characters that we've come to know and love through 8 volumes of RWBY, we now get a little bit more insight into their mentalities at the beginning. Even though it's a non-canon story overall, the way that they act and the way that they think really does resemble how they would have acted and thought in the original series. But with all that being said, I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Let me know down in the comments below how you feel about Ice Queendom as a whole. How did you enjoy it? What was your favorite moment? And what did you like about this episode in particular? Were there any specific character interactions or character moments that you really liked to see, that perhaps you maybe wished we saw in the original RWBY series? I look forward to seeing what you all have to say. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this video, and if you did, make sure to subscribe and join the Guild of the Eternal Flame. Tweet me at PhoenixKnight7, and I'll see you guys in the next video.